We've caught up today with Liz Rowley, who is the leader of the Communist Party of Canada, on her stop in Kamloops as part of her nationwide campaign for the Communist Party. And Liz, can you tell us about your party's position on the climate crisis and what action the Communist Party would like to take, and kind of encapsulate the significant structural problems that we're seeing with the current climate crisis?
Well, that's an excellent question. Yesterday I was very happy to be marching with 100,000 people in the streets of Vancouver on the whole issue of the climate crisis. And the experience was wonderful. It's been quite a long time since we've seen protests of the size that we have in Vancouver. And of course, this was only one part of Canada-wide and worldwide protests. There were close to 500,000 people out in Montreal, and I would say pretty close to 1 million altogether, maybe more, across Canada. So it shows you that indeed the environmental crisis has caught the attention of Canadians. They're very concerned about this issue and not very happy with the alternatives that they are hearing in terms of solutions from the parties that are vying for government. And so we think that the big debate over the carbon tax, which appears to be the main issue on the environment between the Liberals and Conservatives, is not the main issue. The carbon tax has been in place for a little while, and we've seen some small reductions in the carbon tax, but not nearly enough compared to what is required. So we think what needs to be done is legislation needs to be passed unanimously. It would be good in the coming Parliament to cut emissions, carbon emissions, by 50% by 2030, and altogether in terms of new emissions by 2050. Now, there is a problem here, and the problem is the vast power of the oil and the energy corporations like Exxon, Imperial Oil, etc., who have already moved mountains to make sure that fake news about climate change. They're the ones who have said it's all not true. But of course, people know that it is true. And we think that the energy and natural resources belong to the people of Canada. They should never belong to a particular corporation anyway. And so how do we make these decisive changes that are required on the environment? We move these for-profit, multi-billion-dollar corporations out of the way by putting them under public ownership and democratic control. And also our natural resources. And then we can make the decisions that have to be made. And those include things like closing the Alberta tar sands, for example, which are a significant part of carbon emissions in Canada. And the government should guarantee those workers who will be displaced employment in the renewable energy sector, so geothermal, solar, wind power, hydro, etc. And in manufacturing and secondary industry. Alberta is essentially a one-industry province. Because of oil, they figured, various right-wing governments figured they didn't have to do anything else. And now that we're coming to the end of oil and gas and fossil fuels, they're without any alternatives. So we think, for example, an agricultural implements industry located in Alberta that would be useful to farmers. An appliance industry, textiles, shoes, a lot of the things that disappeared with the free trade deals. This would provide good, permanent, well-paid employment for people who are displaced by this change in energy. And we do want to see the development of the renewable energy sector, not in private hands, as the Green Party does, but in public hands. We want to see a single publicly owned energy industry in Canada, including an east-west power grid that would be used to supply energy across the country, but renewable energy. So this also means no pipelines for moving, dirty oil. And the other side of this is, of course, Indigenous rights. And it's the environmental movement and Indigenous peoples who have been the backbone of the opposition, progressive people as well, of course, and certainly the Communist Party. But these are the people who will be most affected by pipelines if they go through. So we also want to see the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights should be adopted as law in Canada, which would require free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples to any kind of economic development that will affect them. And this is key towards any kind of new relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and one we think is long overdue. And of course, just and swift settlement of Indigenous land claims.
The Communist Party has a long and proud history of standing up for peace movements and for standing against wars of aggression and war crimes and crimes against humanity that are currently being committed by Canadian and Western governments. How does the Communist Party plan on fighting that today and during this election?
Well, Canadians, when they voted in the last election in 2015, believed the Liberal Party and the current Prime Minister when he said that Canada's foreign policy was going to be one of peace, as distinct from the Harper government's policies of war and aggression. But in fact, the reality is that the Liberals have continued the Harper policy. And we can see that, and actually gone farther. There's been a very sharp shift to the right in Canadian foreign policy in the last 4 years, and very disturbing and dangerous. And I'm thinking in particular of Canada's role helping to overthrow, or aiming to overthrow, working to overthrow the government of Venezuela, a democratically elected government of President Maduro. And we've Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Minister of War, as I call her, has been active in the forefront of pulling together the Lima Group, which is supposed to be some kind of independent third party informing Canadians about what's really going on. But in fact, who they are Latin American and South American dictators, plus representation from the U.S. and Chrystia Freeland from Canada. And their actual job has been to convince Canadians that overthrowing the Maduro government is an act of justice or something. But the reality is, we've seen Chrystia Freeland recently in a photograph with the pretender Guaido, and also Bolsonaro, who's the new fascist head of government of Brazil. So these are the people that the Liberal government now thinks that Canada should be associating with. And we think this is catastrophic, and so do many Canadians. So we want a foreign policy in which Canada is involved in fighting for peace, respect and disarmament internationally and in Canada, and respects the right of other nations to self-determination and to sovereignty. And if the peoples of Venezuela, for example, or Cuba, want to develop a foreign policy that is not or develop an economy that is not a capitalist economy but moves in the direction of socialism or something, that's their right. And we have no business to interfere trying to overthrow those governments. The last 4 years has also seen Canada deploying troops around the world, not for peacekeeping purposes, but as part of NATO's deployment around the world. So we've sent troops to Mali, we've sent troops all around Russia, China, and wherever the United States wants us to send troops, our government says, aye, aye, sir, and off we go. So this is not something that Canadians in general approve of either, and we think it's very dangerous. Trudeau has also acquiesced to Trump's demand that we increase spending for NATO in Canada. And we think we should get out of NATO. This is imperialism's global army. They've announced recently that they no longer see the North Atlantic as that they're somehow responsible for, or as their field of operations. It's now global. And so we want part of peace and disarmament in Canada. It means we should get out of that NATO, and we should also call for it to be dissolved. We want political solutions to international problems, not military ones. This demand for more money for NATO, by the way, comes with a big price tag. The Liberals have increased military spending in Canada by 73%. Which means over a 10-year period, and they're hoping people won't notice because it's, over 10 years, but they're not asking the corporations to pay for that. They expect you to pay for it, and me too. And and this is going to mean more cuts to social programs, to healthcare, to education, to the things that are important to Canadians. And so we want to rescind that increase, and we want to see overall a 75% cut to military spending. That's a lot of money, and it could be used for funding education and health and welfare, and increased minimum wage, job creation, the green retrofits that are going to need to be done if we're serious about the environment, and a lot more. So. I think that we've moved in exactly the wrong direction. We want peace, we want disarmament in Canada, and an international foreign policy that regards the right to self-determination and sovereignty as vital and important.
Liz, what is the party's approach to dealing with what seems like systemic racism in Canada in terms of Indigenous rights and the Canadian government's relationship? And if you could touch on the immigration issue as well, and refugees, and elaborate on that, please.
I think the systemic racism is the right word. Canadians got a real shock when they saw the blackface scandal around Trudeau. But maybe not everybody was quite that shocked, because certainly the Liberal government's policies and the Conservative government's policies over, since Confederation and before then, are laced through with systemic racism. This goes together with capitalism. And big corporations make money because they can pay, people of color, racialized people, less than they pay white people. They can pay women less than they pay men. They can pay Indigenous people less, and so forth. So this is built into capitalism. And the fact that there's sort of casual racism and the kind of get-ups that Trudeau and his family are involved in, it sort of reflects that they're part of the ruling class. They not only represent them in government, but they're actually part of the ruling class, and that's the way they see things. So just in terms of government policy, which has facilitated this, this profiteering, we can see the genocidal policies against Indigenous peoples that, began 500 years ago with the arrival of, European colonial powers. Their interest was to grab the land and the resources under them, and Indigenous people were living on the land, and their solution to this conundrum for them was simply to kill everybody who was on the land. And they were quite successful in Newfoundland, where they eliminated the Beothuk people with mass murder. And this was a policy that was continued all over Canada, all over North America. And they weren't successful in completing a genocide, but in fact those policies continue today in things like the residential schools, which aim to destroy Indigenous culture, and many Indigenous children were killed. I would say they were murdered. And you can get all of the detail about that if you read the report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We want those, the recommendations of those inquiry and commission to be implemented. They should have been implemented a long time ago. Another indicator would be this federal government. This is the one that promised a new relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada. However, they have continued to appeal court decisions and rulings of the United Nations that the federal government is discriminating against Indigenous children by underfunding their education, health care, and social services. as compared to the general population. And that they have appealed various rulings. They're still appealing it. They say they're all for reconciliation, but what they are doing is flies in the face of everything they are saying. It's racism. So we think that, as I said earlier, that we need to enact the parts of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which would also require equal or better funding, equitable or better funding, to address the crisis on reserves and facing Indigenous peoples in general on and off reserves. So something, money has to be delivered to improve housing, infrastructure for clean water, sewers, schools, health care, all of the things that are necessary for people to have a reasonable life. This should have been done a long time ago. And also land claim settlement. The fact that the government has dragged its feet now for generations, refusing to deal with and to negotiate a just settlement of land claims is another indicator that not much has changed in 500 years. That's why many people say we're still dealing with colonialism. We think we're dealing with imperialism, but it's the same policy, however you look at it. Then there's the question of racialized people, many of whom were born in Canada. They're not immigrants, but the wages that they receive and the are much lower than what people who are white in Canada receive. Their housing, substandard housing, very often, and certainly discrimination in housing. We hear stories all of the time. We all know about these, that people apply for an apartment to rent, and it's available until they get there, and the landlord sees their faces, and then suddenly it's been rented. So there needs to be enforcement of laws against discrimination against in housing and also in employment. So there is also then the issue of policing, and people of color are overly policed. They're the subject of racial profiling. And certainly if you look at the statistics of the prison populations in Canada, Canada's prisons are filled with people who are either Indigenous or racialized. And this has to stop, and it should have been stopped a long time ago. We think the police should be put under civilian controls and should be, should have to face the music if they are, found guilty of attacking Indigenous people. And as we know, there are all sorts of incidents, and many of them are specified in these reports. Missing and murdered women and Truth and Reconciliation, where Indigenous people are taken out to the edge of town, stripped of their clothing in the middle of the winter and left to die. So the police should be held accountable to that. It should be stopped, but where these crimes have been committed, the police should be held accountable. It should go to jail and should face serious consequences. On the question of immigration, contrary to what the anti-people party is saying, we are not facing any kind of mass immigration. In fact, Canada's immigration has been more and more restricted over the years, from the period in the 1960s where it was more open than by a long shot than it is today. And we are, because of particularly with the Harper government, we've seen serious restrictions placed on immigration. And now we have where families can't be reunited, etc. And we also have the Foreign Temporary Workers program, which is strips workers of any labor rights, which cover all other workers in Canada, makes them virtual. It's almost forced labor, because their employers are in a position where they can, have them deported at any time. So these policies are very dangerous. We also have the Safe Third Country Act, thanks to Harper, which the Liberals have left all this stuff in place. And this act requires that people coming from the United States as refugees to Canada, why are they coming? Because of the laws that Trump has passed. attacking minorities, and in particular people from Arab countries or Muslims. And they cannot come to Canada through the usual entry ports because they'll be deported back to the United States. So it forces them to come into Canada through very unsafe methods. Coming through farmers' fields in the middle of winter, carrying little kids in their arms and so on. And we've heard. Everybody's seen on television the consequences of that. People with serious injuries, people who've almost died, children who've been put through, through these terrible experiences. So this is the reality, and this should be stopped. All of it should be stopped. We should get out of the Safe Third Country Act. We should make sure that refugees and immigrants are welcome in Canada and not attacked, and that their entry is facilitated. We should, I think I've spoken about the racist policies in Canada. We want them abolished, and we want to see equality, real equality in Canada for everyone who lives here.
The working class is always under assault from the capitalist ruling class, the one percenters, the billionaires. What is the Communist Party's approach to addressing joblessness, underemployment, low wages? Can you elaborate, please?
I think the answer to that is for the next Parliament to curb corporate power in Canada. Well, the best answer is socialism, because the problems that working people are facing are caused by capitalism. But unfortunately, socialism's not on the agenda in this election. But it is something that we want working people to think about, because all of these problems have capitalism at their base. But the next Parliament can certainly take strong action to curb corporate power, and this ties in with the issue of work and joblessness and wages and so on through the free trade agreement, and what it is doing to workers like the workers at General Motors in Oshawa, for example, and for that matter, auto workers and other workers across our country. So the free trade agreement is not about trade, although it was sold that way in 1988. What it's actually, it is a corporate constitution which allows the biggest companies like the big three automakers to move their production wherever they want to in the hemisphere across North America. And where they're going to set up is where the wages are lowest. And the situation in Canada is, with more than 30% of the labor force unionized, our wages are better here than they are anywhere else in the hemisphere. And as far as the Communist Party is concerned, that's a good thing. And we would like to see a race to the top. We'd like to see workers in the United States and Mexico also making good wages, and also unionized, and also having a better life than the life they have now. Well, I said that the highest pay for auto workers is in Canada, so it's about $30 an hour. In the U.S., it's about $16 an hour. And in Mexico, it's $3 an hour. So if you were the CEO of General Motors, you would also set up your operations in Mexico and say goodbye to Canada. Doesn't matter how good the production is, your profits are going to be a lot higher if your wages are 1/10 of what they are in Canada. So this suits the corporations, but it doesn't suit workers in Canada. It doesn't suit the Canadian economy either. It's going to hurt. There's going to be a huge ripple effect, because of course it isn't only General Motors and it isn't only the Oshawa plant that are going to close. It will be all of the big three operations that will close down sooner or later. And whether we like it or not, auto is still the engine of the Canadian economy, and there will be many people will find themselves out of work. So the solution, of course, and I should also say, it isn't only auto. It is going to have everything to do with manufacturing and secondary industry. Workers who work in those sectors are going to be facing the same competition with low-waged workers in Mexico and the United States. So the solution is to get out of the free trade deals. The USMCA deal hasn't yet been ratified by Parliament. The next Parliament should refuse to ratify it. Say no thanks. It's bad for Canada. We're not going to do it. And by the looks of things, we could have a minority government, and this would be the opportunity to actually defeat this deal. It should be done. We also want to see plant closure legislation. So this would be a legislation which would require corporations like General Motors and all of them to show just cause why they're closing their plants. And to say, well, because we can pay workers 1/10 of what we pay in Canada if we move our operations. No, not an acceptable reason, not a good reason. You can't do it. You can leave, but your plant and your operations stay here. And in the case of General Motors, what we are saying is if we had plant closure legislation, then we should stop General Motors. But in the current situation where we don't have that and we're in the free trade deals, the government should actually nationalize the General Motors and all of the big three operations in Canada. And this should be part of a new transportation policy and system in Canada. We should be building electric cars in Oshawa. But there's lots of operations and we could do a lot more than electric cars. So we want to see, for example, mass rapid transit should be built in Canada, could be built in those plants. And we want to see rail for interurban service. Now with Greyhound departing from northern and remote communities, there's a big hole there. How do people get from A to B unless they own a car, a gas guzzling car? So we need a publicly owned transportation system that will meet their needs too. So a new transportation system, which we could look at implementing. We could thank General Motors for that push in that direction. But it's overdue and it's important. It should be publicly owned. It should be under democratic control. And it should include Bombardier, by the way, because they've been at the public trough, just like General Motors and the rest of them, for a very long time. We virtually own the company based on public investments in it. So let's have a complete transportation industry under public ownership.
We've had a significant problem with deindustrialization in BC, and part of that is the closure of all our, not all, but many of our sawmills and lumber mills. How would the Communist Party address problems like that?
Well, we think that, for a long time Canada has been a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods for the United States. That's a big problem with our trade policy, that 80% of our trade is with the U.S. So we want a new trade policy, by the way, that's based on a multilateral trade and that's mutually beneficial. And this would include, for example, that we don't have mass exports of raw materials. We need to set up value-added industries and manufacturing secondary industry so that what we're exporting here is stuff like furniture, for example. It would create a lot of jobs and it would keep some of the wealth here in Canada that would be created by value-added jobs. And so beyond logging, well, let me also say around logging before we move off there, the whole issue of softwood lumber, which has been a big irritant, as they say, but a big issue for workers, is part of the free trade deal. It's part of what's wrong with free trade in this country, that the U.S. has been pushing and pushing and pushing. They keep going to these trade panels to appeal Canada's policy on softwood lumber. They keep getting defeated and they keep going back for more. So at some point, the Canadian government, hopefully the next government and the next parliament will say that's enough. This is a bad deal. Let's get out of it. And this is impacting on jobs too because of these kinds of things. So we want to see, I think I mentioned, a growth in manufacturing and secondary industry because that's value-added work for workers in this country. We need to develop these industries in order for Canada to have a secure future for the country and for working people who need to earn a living here. That's where the good jobs are. And they need, there are all kinds of things that could be done, green retrofits for schools, for public buildings, for infrastructure. We want to see 1 million units of affordable social housing built. And when I say affordable, we look at the housing experts who say affordable means you don't pay more than 20% of your income on shelter. And this would put a lot of construction workers to work for quite a while. But houses also need appliances, they need furniture, and this is secondary industry and manufacturing. We also want to see the development of a national child care program. We want to open up universities and colleges so that students who have the marks but not the money are able to go. That means building more universities and colleges. I can say more about that, but we're talking about jobs now. So, this is the way to move forward, we think. And so secondary industry and manufacturing is very important for Canada. And so far, none of the governments we've had since World War II seem to be at all interested. But Canadians are interested. They want to work, and they have a right to work. Not right to work legislation, but they have a right to a good, to good jobs and full employment.
The Communist Party has a position to reduce the work week and achieve full employment. Can you tell us about that?
Well, this is not a new demand, but it's a demand whose time has come. We have 2 million people in Canada who are unemployed. So they may be, they could be completely unemployed or partly unemployed, but we've got 2 million people who are not participating in full-time work and who are looking for work. So this idea that somehow we have the lowest unemployment rate in history is, it's just statisticians playing with figures and the Liberals trying to make the most of it. And there is a big problem, and the way to address it, and also with work, changing work that we hear about all the time with tech change and artificial intelligence coming and so forth. So we need to have a radical solution. And a radical solution is a shorter work week with no loss in take-home pay. And specifically, we are proposing a 32-hour work week with 40 hours take-home pay. And what this would do would be to enable people who want to work to work at good jobs, hopefully unionized and well paid. So it would cut out the gig economy and precarious work, but it would also give people a chance to have another life, another part to their lives, other than going to work and coming home and going back to work again. Because very few people now work 40 hours a week. A lot of people work 2, sometimes even 3 jobs. And if they have one job, they're working weekends, so they're taking their work home with them. So it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way, where half the country is overworked and the other half is hardly working, and very hungry. So this is a policy which we are fighting for, and we would like other parties to steal this policy, because and many of our other policies too. It's a good policy. It's a good solution. And its time has come.
What is the Communist Party's position on social programs?
We think that social programs have been severely eroded over the last 30 years as a result of austerity and a combination of Liberal and Conservative governments delivering austerity. And we point out that expanding social programs will meet the needs of Canadians for services. It also is a way to create jobs. And so, for example, a national child care program that is public and that is free for children will create a lot of jobs in the construction of child care centers and in employing child care workers who will be adequately trained and have their ECE certifications and so on, and should be properly paid, by the way. And why is that important? Because women work in this country, and if they're not working, they're looking for work. And we have a social responsibility to make sure that our children are safely cared for while we're at work. That's a social responsibility. The Liberals promised in 1993 in their little famous red book that they were going to deliver a system like that. Well, that's more than 25 years ago now, and they're not even talking about it in this election. The time has come. We need a national child care program, a pan-Canadian childcare program that's quality and that's public and that's free. We also want to see Medicare expanded, and of course, I'm sure your viewers will be quite familiar with the fact that Medicare is under attack in this country. Certainly by the conservatives, who speak for, more often than not, for the big box U.S. Healthcare corporations, and by the Liberals, who seem to be absolutely blind to incursions of privatization of services and fees that are being charged. They're also facing a court case now here in British Columbia over the single-payer system, and a clinic in Vancouver that wants to be able to, charge their services to healthcare corporations, insurance companies, and so on. So we want to see enforcement of the Canada Health Act. We have one system, a single-payer system that's universal, and we cut out the private for-profit, gluttons, I can say, who want to take advantage of people who are ill. And we want to expand Medicare. It should include dental care, should include vision care, mental health care, long-term care, and it should include pharmacare. Pharmacare is a bit of an issue in this election, thanks to the Liberals and the NDP, but I think it's important to say that what the Liberals are proposing is not pharmacare. What they've actually said is that they are thinking about, maybe sometime in the future, hopefully not 25 years from now, but what they're proposing we don't want anyway. And what it is not to include pharmacare within Medicare, but to simply cover with public insurance people who aren't already covered by private insurance. And that's not Medicare, that's a patchwork such as exists in the United States. It just makes public insurance, so the single payer system, one part of a private insurers. And we don't want that. We want Medicare to be inclusive of pharmacare. We also think that we should nationalize the pharmaceutical companies, which have been profiteering on the backs of Canadians for a very long time. So this is important. We are unclear what the NDP's policy is. It would be useful if they would clarify what they're actually proposing. And we invite them to steal our policy on Medicare, that it should be completely inclusive of all of these services, including pharmaceuticals. And finally, on education, which is the other big one, students are being asked to pay virtually the full cost of education, post-secondary students. So whether they're at university or colleges, they're being absolutely hosed. And to gain entrance to university these days, you either have to have parents with very deep pockets or be willing to take on a debt the size of a small mortgage when you graduate. And it's very unfair, and it doesn't make sense. We hear all the time about how the world of work is changing, how we need to have a highly educated workforce in Canada, etc. So why wouldn't we invest in that? We say we should invest in it. And the payback is enormous. It's a highly educated workforce. It will put Canada, in the top runnings internationally. And so how do you do that? Well, you eliminate tuition fees for students. You make post-secondary education, access to it simply based on students' interest and on their marks. If they have the marks, they should get in. We should eliminate, write off all existing student debts. And we should pay students a stipend, so to cover their living costs while they're studying. This is a very important investment, and the things that we are campaigning for that I've just spoken about, people say, well, how will you pay for that? And so the answer is pretty straightforward. We want to use some of that military spending, that bloated, very dangerous military spending should be spent on health, education, social programs, child care, pay and employment equity, all these things. A higher minimum wage, I don't think I mentioned. We want to see $20 minimum wage. That's one of the ways to raise wages. We want to also raise pensions substantially and to make them fully accessible at age 60, not partially, but fully. A guaranteed annual living wage to put a floor under everybody. These are the ways to make life livable and with dignity. So in addition to military spending, we also want to increase the tax load on big corporations. It used to be in the post-war period that every tax dollar, 50 cents came from corporations and 50 cents came from individuals. Now it's about 95 cents from individuals and about 5 cents from corporations. So we have, as tax experts will tell you, who aren't in the pockets of the corporations, but the ones at universities will tell you, we have virtually a flat tax situation here in Canada. So we need a progressive tax system that will put the load on those most able to pay, and that's the corporations. And we should reverse all of these tax cuts. We should and close the tax loopholes, require them to pay their deferred and unpaid corporate taxes. We should bring back the capital tax. We should make capital gains tax taxable at 100% of the gain. We should introduce wealth and inheritance taxes. Everybody knows about the 1%. Well, let's do something about that. And I think the NDP's demands around wealth taxes are very, very modest. We could do much more than that, and we should. They can afford to pay, and they should pay. In the 50s and 60s, corporations paid. The corporate tax rate was 70–80%. And you know, the economy was booming, and people were working, and life was pretty good. So it wasn't those taxes that made them go away. And we need to, well, we're proposing a 30% corporate tax rate. And why should we have that money? For education, for health care, for social programs, for properly financing the health and education of Indigenous people, and settling land claims fairly and justly, and a lot more.
What is the Communist Party's position on proportional representation?
Well, we are very strongly supportive of proportional representation, and we think most Canadians are. There have been various referenda across the country, which, if the proportional representation forces had had the adequate funds to explain to people what it is, I'm quite convinced it would have passed. Here in British Columbia and also in Ontario, we had one in Ontario in 2007, or 2007, and in other places too. So proportional representation is attractive to people because of the fact that we've had very right-wing governments like the Harper government, with 60% of voters voting against it, able to actually form a majority government and govern as though they had the confidence of the whole country, when in fact the majority were really distressed with the kind of policies that they were unveiling. So people are looking for something that is a lot more democratic and a lot more responsive to public opinion, and that will carry through on the kinds of policies that people want. And that's the attraction to PR. We have been campaigning for proportional representation for many, many years. And we see that around the world, there are a lot of countries have proportional representation. And small parties have been able to elect. The Communist Party has a representation, but also social democratic parties usually have larger representation, more in line with the support that they have in the population. We see more women elected with proportional representation, more racialized people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities. It's just a system which will guarantee a much more representative parliament and one much more attuned, because of the numbers, that it doesn't first past the post ensures that whoever gets more than everybody else in a particular riding is elected, even though that may be well under a majority may have voted against them and against their government. So that's the appeal to it. Of course, you may know that the Communist Party has been fighting for electoral reforms of all sorts for many, many years. We went in the 1990s through quite a battle with the Rowley government, which in 1993, just weeks before that federal election, brought in legislation requiring political parties to field a minimum of 50 candidates and put $50,000 on the table before they even spent a nickel on a leaflet, which they had to deposit with the government. And most small parties lost those deposits. They never got them back. And so the Communist Party, and the consequences of not doing that were to be deregistered, so that any party caught in that loop would be unable to participate in federal elections, unable to issue tax receipts, or, it'd be very difficult for them to make their views known. Well, the Communist Party was caught in that web. It was intended to, Mulroney was intending to wipe out all of the small parties in Canada, plus the Bloc Québécois, which was just being born at that time, and anticipating the Green Party and so forth. It was a really draconian move. We decided that we had to fight them, and we took them to court using their charter rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that they had discriminated against all the small parties. We had the support of the Green Party at that time, as well as the Marxist-Leninist Party, and many prominent members of the NDP, and also of some from the Bloc Québécois. And many Canadians, we fought in the courts. We also fought in the court of public opinion, and people understood what we were doing. We won at the lower level, so the government appealed. And then we won at the appealed levels, and they appealed again. And we finally, was finally settled in the Ontario Supreme Court, and we didn't win everything, but we won the most important parts of our case. We regained our registration. The funds that they took from us, we got back, and we opened the door for small parties to exist in Canada. And this was the Figueroa case. This is the name of our previous leader, Miguel Figueroa, and it's a case that's one of the important ones in Canadian electoral law litigation, and in litigation about democracy in this country.
What is your take on the rise of far-right organizations? We see it happening all over Europe right now, in Latin America, South America, and of course, how does that play into the rise of these organizations in Canada and during this election?
Mm-hmm. Well, we think, that the 2008 economic meltdown in the United States really shook the capitalist system. And one of the responses to that is the rise of very far-right parties. There was a poll taken last winter in Canada, asking people how they're doing at the end of the month. How's your life? And more than 50% of those who were polled responded by saying that they were $200 away from disaster at the end of every month. So 50% is a very high number. And so the next obvious question is, well, how many are $300 away from disaster? So a lot of people are living right on the edge. They're feeling that they're not well served, that they could lose their jobs anytime, that they could lose their homes anytime, that they have no security. And some of them are saying, well, capitalism isn't working for me, and I want to look and see what else there is. So, they pay these big right-wing corporate think tanks in order to solve these problems for them. When people start to worry about capitalism, well, what are we going to do? And I think, this poll must have scared the pants off, people who make a lot of money out of the capitalist system and out of the current misery that so many people are facing. And their solution is, well, if capitalism isn't working for you, well, try a little fascism. And as we can see in Europe, people who maybe don't belong to trade unions, have no experience with any kind of, social justice movements, can be taken in by that kind of stuff. And the stuff that they're selling is the stuff that Bernier and the Anti-People's Party are selling. And that is, you're having a rough time, you can't pay your bills, your life isn't good. It's that union. that guy who's making $5 an hour more than you are. It's those immigrants who are stealing your jobs. It's women who don't know their place. It's Indigenous people who, I mean, it's a very long list. It's Muslims, etc. So they are pushing these right-wing explanations, these semi-fascist explanations. And if you think I'm overdoing it here in describing these, let's look at Maxime Bernier's billboard campaign where they said, mass immigration must stop. But there's no mass immigration in this country. It's a lie. But fake news, as they say, is their stock in trade. So we can see that there is this push to drive politics to the right, to the Conservative Party, which is the party that has the links. I mean, Mr. Bernier came out of the Conservative Party, and if you look at their platforms, they're not very different. Both of them have links to the Soldiers of Odin, for example, to Faith Goldie, a white supremacist who's been banned from Facebook, to Charles McVety, and to these racist and fascist movements, which are responsible for, endangering people. They're not only talk machines; they're actually involved in acts, in hate acts, and endangering people. So this is a very dangerous development. The difference between the Liberals and Tories is that the Liberals don't have these connections that the Tories do. But the Liberals and the Tories are both big business parties. And our message is that there's no solution with big business parties, and that the solutions, in quotes, being offered on the right are extremely dangerous to working people, to youth, to Indigenous people, to women, and that the real solutions are on the left. We need to build up the left forces in the next parliament. We'd like to see the next parliament with 30 communists in it, and a good large progressive bloc of left-thinking people. We think the best outcome in this dangerous situation would be to deny both the Liberals and the Conservatives the majority government, and to completely shut out Bernier and that lot. And with a large progressive bloc, we could prevent either minority government from being able to carry out the worst parts of their agenda. And we think it would be possible also to use that leverage, working with the trade union movement and the people's movements, to force adoption of some of the most important parts of the people's agenda that we are advocating: cutting the arms budget, raising the minimum wage, acting on construction of social housing, things that are very important to people, plant closure legislation, and so forth. So there's a lot to lose in this election, but there's also a fair bit to gain. Some people have asked us, well, who would be in this progressive bloc? Are you endorsing the NDP or the Greens? No, we're not. We're not endorsing them. But we know that there are people who are likely to be elected from those parties that we could work with on specific issues. On the issue of proportional representation, for example, we've worked with the Greens before. Other issues, healthcare, housing. We're not. I think the NDP is advocating 500,000 units of social housing should be built. Okay, let's work on 750,000. These are urgent questions facing people. We know that we're not the only ones who are concerned. We think our party has the best platform in terms of addressing the urgent problems facing people. We think it's better than any of the other parties by quite a lot. But we know that there's support for this kind of a platform, and that we could certainly generate support from other sectors as well outside of Parliament. And that's what it's actually going to take. The problems that we're facing now as a society are still going to be there on October 22nd. Shocking, I know, but true. And it's also the case that, as in the struggle for Medicare, for example, or any of the other really important things that we have won in Canada, it was never just legislated by a good-hearted government. It was always fought for by people in struggle in the streets, people fighting with petitions and protests, like the big climate strike yesterday. That's the kind of action that needs to be built up in this country, working with progressive people in Parliament and communists in the first place, that can achieve the kind of changes we need today. So I invite your listeners to vote communist this time.
And thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule on your national campaign.
Thank you very much.